He's editor-in-chief of Breitbart News and a New York Times best-selling author. And on this podcast, he brings deep research, prescient analysis, and world-class guests. He's Alex Marlow, and this is the Alex Marlow Show.
All right, big show today. We're talking to Carol Roth later, who is an expert in small business, and we do a little debating because not too much. We agree on most stuff, but she's not pro-tariff naturally, and kind of fleshing out each other's views is, I think, the enjoyable endeavor. We don't need to all be tribal here and agree all the time. So it makes for an interesting conversation, and she's a good hang. So you'll enjoy that. But before then, we got a lot of news. I will note, I was on Laura Ingram's show last night. I have not seen them pull the clip. I don't know why. It seemed pretty good. And it was I know people like to see me pop up places. If you do, just hit the DVR. I've been going on that show once a week. It's usually between Wednesday and Friday. So, and then, you can just see it and it's fun. We talked a lot about, is there a Democrat civil war going on? There's a lot of discussion on whether or not the Democrats are actually going to have a civil war. Is it already happening? Can David Hogg precipitate a civil war at 25 years old as a vice chair or whatever of the party? I don't know. I don't think that's necessarily the case. But it's interesting because one of the Democrats' strengths over the last 20 years or so is they are cohesive. They always end up getting together and voting. The ones who are seen as anti-establishment, like Bernie Sanders was seen, the ones who were seen as hard left or moderate, they would all come together and vote the same way. This is one of my beefs with the John Fettermans of the world, is that he talks like he's a moderate, but then he just votes with Democrats every single time. This has been one of their strengths, but it's not working anymore, that they do not have the ability to command the culture the way they have in the past. They do not have the ability to command the news media, which has been largely overwhelmed by the conservative new media space and now the emerging podcast space. And they don't have the clout they used to have on the campuses because not everyone's going to school or respecting the degrees as much. So they're really having a hard time with their branding. And so the question is, can they pull off a civil war? Will they have a civil war? And I don't know. I spent some time with Matt Boyle. We talk a lot about this on my Breitbart Fight Club show. Those of you who like the additional content that is on the Breitbart app today. But I talked to Boyle about this both on and offline about, is this really happening? Where are the big Democrat consultants, the ones who can really move the needle in the party? And a lot of them are overseas. A lot of them are in Europe. We were running down some people, and I think they're looking for work over there or they're vacationing, but they are not saying we're going to a civil war now and we're really going to have it out amongst ourselves. And the Democrats would probably, I don't know how it would go for them if they do it. So that it really is the question. Is there really going to be a civil war? Because for us, the Republican Party, as I've said many times on the show and every other show that has me on for long enough, we had our civil war and the America First side won, and it worked out great. Is that we went from the Republican establishment politely losing every single election to the Democrats being completely overwhelmed by the force of nature that is Donald Trump and his America First movement. So that worked out great for us because we could have had Jeb Bush in 2016, but we had Donald Trump, and Donald Trump won, and Donald Trump won in 2024 with a America First guy on the ticket with him, J.D. Vance. So, and he's bringing all of these people to heel, the Marco Rubios of the world, the people who were part of the establishment are now card-carrying members of Trump's movement. So we did that. It worked out great. Can the Democrats pull that off? Well, they probably have no other option than to try because the party's approval ratings in the toilet. They've got no charismatic leadership, and no one can really compete with Trump over the next half dozen or the next half dozen Republicans who I think are waiting in the wings to step up and be next. So they're got to do something, but what is it that they're going to do? And is there a coordinated effort? Are there any even major signs that they're in for a real shakeup? I'm not really seeing them as of now, but whatever is going to go on, the next crop of Democrats, they're all woke, they're all shrill, they all have terrible manners. They do this thing where they just swear for no reason, just for everything is worthy of swear words, which used to be something that was frowned upon with politicians. You got to know the rules and you can break them, but they're just breaking the rules all the time because they think that's going to be appealing to people. And they just do all this grandstanding, flying down to El Salvador for no reason. They just push all these out-of-touch policies like men and women's sports. We need to coddle every illegal alien. We like Chinese sweatshop labor. We need to scrounge up another $2 billion for Harvard favored. Trump just busts them so bad. He just corners them all the time now, where he just gets them to take these positions that are so unpopular. Just demonstrably, no one really thinks Harvard needs that $2 billion. No one does. So, and he's got the whole party staking out that territory. So Trump just backs him to all these corners. So they've got this high energy base, the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortezes of the world. The donors seem to like them. But are they national candidates? I don't know if they're national candidates. I don't know if they're appealing to people. If you go further than 3 miles away from a university, is there a constituency for that type of person? I don't know if there is. And they might have to test it, but I just don't think that David Hogg announcing some things have to change means that we're actually going to get a civil war. I will know when the consultants start signing on for outside the box candidates and they start taking very aggressive lines targeting other Democrats. So I'm not seeing it, but I'll tell you what I likened it to on the show yesterday, on Laura's show, it is. Remember the brilliant movie Alien versus Predator 2004? The greatest tagline in history, whoever wins, we lose. Well, this could be the inverse of that. It's whoever wins, we win. Because if they fight amongst themselves, it might not go well for them. And I'm not necessarily seeing the fight taking place, taking shape. But if they do, we might end up being the beneficiaries, we on the right. So that's kind of the big point I wanted to make at the top of the show. And there's a lot of evidence to back up that this is a lot of people want this to happen. The DNC is talking about kicking David Hogg out of his post for attempting to primary other Democrats, probably within their right to do that. They also have to be really annoyed at this point that Hogg got in to this role because of a AstroTurf campaign led by conservatives, specifically my friend Alex Bruzewicz, who's been a guest on this show. I had a very fascinating conversation with a couple months back. You guys can get that wherever you get your pods. And he basically manifested the Hogg candidacy because he thought it would be entertaining and amusing. And Hogg was able to actually win. So it was great. It was sort of, do you remember when Rush Limbaugh did a thing, I forget what it's called, Operation something or other. One of you email me, aloha@alexmarlow.com. But he did a big Operation something or other where he would try to get Republicans in races that didn't matter to register Democrats, vote as Democrats, and vote for their least electable candidate. And Operation Chaos, maybe? I think that's what it was. But he used to do that, and that's sort of what happened here. That was the playbook that we ran. So CNN says there's a revolt within the Democratic Party and sirens should be going off because Dem favorability is going down. Chuck Schumer's favorability is going down. Boyle thinks AOC should run against Schumer and not try to act like she's a national candidate yet. And that could be really cool. Can you imagine that news cycle? Again, that's another one where whoever wins, we win. Because if AOC wins, then taking out Schumer, Democrats just eating one of their most powerful people would be huge. And then also with, and if AOC loses, it shows that a lot of her appeal is hype and it's not real. So either way, it's really exciting and I would love to see that happening. George Clooney's out there with a very funky hairstyle now that he's got this very completely pitch black hair. It's just a terrible look for older men. I think this is a Broadway thing. He's doing a play on Broadway where maybe that's why he's doing this, but the hair dye stuff is just very off-putting. I recommend this to all men. And I know there's some older men in the audience. It doesn't look good when your hair gets darker as you get older. You have to at least incorporate some of the salt and pepper. So if you're going to do some of the dye, you still have to make it look, do a little hat tip to God Almighty and the aging process by not going completely dark. It's just a terrible look, and I don't know why men do this. And I want to help you in the audience. If you're doing this, stop. And if you have friends don't let friends dye their hair completely black when they're 70 years old. They just don't do it. So how old's Clooney now? He's looking really old. Ironically, he looks older with his weird darkened hair. But maybe he's only 60. But anyway, he looks like he's 70 here with the fake dye job. But he's out there saying Democrats don't have anyone as charismatic as Trump. And he's basically he's suggesting that there are some real weaknesses in the party. He said the Democrats also need a sense of humor to beat Trump. And that's really noteworthy because the Democrats are also toying with the idea of this dark woke concept where maybe they're just going to go headlong into the wokeness and they're not going to look back. They're going to call for more DEI and just lean into that. because they're going to stick to their guns. There's a huge movement within the party to try to do that. Case in point, Eva Longoria, another actress who spends most of her time as a Democrat activist and a champion for far left causes. She calls DEI a moral imperative and is good business. So she actually thinks that despite all of the Larry Finks of the world who had gone woke and are now coming back because they think it's bad for business, the people with actual money at stake, a Democrat activist / actress is out there saying, no, it's actually good business, even though you get the stuff like Snow White, where you go very woke and then you lose hundreds of millions of dollars. Doesn't affect her. She wants them to do the dark woke stuff where they're really going headlong into the woke space. So you can't have woke and also have a sense of humor. So this is where the Civil War might happen, because someone has got to identify in the Democratic Party that you do have to make a choice. Are we woke, or do we have a sense of humor? Because you can't have both. Because woke is anti-humor, it's anti-fun, it's anti-making light of ourselves, it's pro-taking yourself too seriously. So, and you look at the Democrats now, left-wing activists. Here's an 83-year-old man vandalized 5 Teslas at a Long Island shopping mall, and he says Trump should effing die. So, in a way, this is funny, but that's not them having a sense of humor. That's us having a sense of humor at them. 83 years old. Could you imagine being 83 and being this angry and having nothing of meaning in your life that you have to vandalize Teslas? A car designed by a guy who used to be sort of liberal and made them for liberals to try to save the planet. And now Trump should effing die. And now we're just going to harass other liberals with our violence. An Ohio woman faces an arrest for allegedly pelting Teslas with dog feces from a moving car. So she's driving around and she's throwing dog crap on Teslas. Again, it's funny. It is funny, but it's not funny in the way you would think it would be funny. It's funny because these people are so pathetic and lost that they're driven to this sort of juvenile vandalism, even though they're grown adults. So all of this works out splendidly for us, shows how messed up they are. It also exposes their violent nature. The left is always trying to act like we're the violent ones. They're the ones who've consistently, throughout my entire life following these issues, they've been the ones that have been more violent. And it just gives us a real chance. It gives us a real chance to capitalize. I do not think that Hogg can pull off doing a civil war by himself, though. For the record, I don't really see that happening. Something that I wanted to play for you guys was the one other thing. Here's a clip of Susan Rice. She's talking about Susan Rice is Obama's right-hand person, one of the most powerful women in the Democratic Party. She was talking about Pete Hegseth here, but listen to some of the texture of this conversation she's having. She's doing a podcast. Check this out.
Well, if you're a white male, Christian, cisgender, macho, MAGA man, you can be as dumb as a rock and be deemed qualified to serve as Secretary of Defense.
So first of all, I've never heard anyone use the word cis literally. So cis means that you are the biological sex that you were born with, you identify with that. I use it all the time, but I always use it ironically. She's using it literally. And just listen to this diatribe that she thinks she's cooking right here. She's actually just revealing that she's a racist, sexist. But I'm going to play this again.
Well, if you're a white male, Christian, cisgender, macho, MAGA man, you can be as dumb as a rock and be deemed qualified to serve as Secretary of Defense. That's apparently what we've learned from this episode. But
so it's all that's racist. It's sexist. It's not funny. They have no sense of humor. It's so angry, and she's so uncharismatic. I love playing these clips because it just shows who would want to be on her side. The other thing about Pete Hegseth is he's not dumb. He went to Harvard and Princeton. He went to Princeton for undergraduate and Harvard for a master's. So he's really impressed me with his brain. And look, we're a Breitbart. We were hugely supportive of Pete Hegseth. He has had some zipper issues in the past. He admits he's had some drinking issues in the past. He's a little on the nose, some of his fashion sensibilities. Okay, you want to point that stuff out, fine, but it has nothing to do with him being smart. He's a very smart guy. I was turned on to his brain when I heard him do an interview for one of his books. with Dennis Prager, and he held court with Prager for 30 minutes on PragerU Show. This was many years ago. And I couldn't believe it because he's obviously an accomplished guy and he's a handsome guy. He's Make America Handsome Again caucus. But he really does have the intellectual heft to do any sort of job he wants to do. So, but they want to try to crush him because they see him as a real threat long-term, could be a potential presidential ticket type guy if he does well. And if he does poorly, it'll be a big message sent from the insiders, the DC Beltway establishment, to the rest of us that we are an exclusive club and you are not allowed to join it. If you want to go the talk show route, that's where you got to stay. You cannot come back and hold down a serious job like cabinet secretary. So really noteworthy. Let's see where she goes with this.
But let's also be clear. There's a serious point here. DEI has been used as a slur to suggest that anybody who might be a woman, might be a person of color, might be a religious minority, might have a disability, might be a religious minority, might be a veteran or of Native descent, anybody who has benefited in any way, shape, or form from the notion that we all should be treated equally and that we should be viewed on the basis of our merits and not discounted because we happen to be a woman or happen to be a person of color. Anybody who fits the mold of somebody who is not a white Christian cisgender male
Get to the point.
is by definition in this administration deemed inferior. That is the vast majority, Brian, of the people in this country.
Wow. That was really, I can't believe it took her that long to make that point. So she's suggesting that if you basically DEI is like a slur, here's the flip side to that. And this is very important, is that if you use DEI for a hiring process and for an admissions process, then if you're a qualified person who is not a cisgender white Christian male, then people will wonder if you got that role because of some sort of diversity hire or because you actually earned it. And over time, things do have a way, the cream rises to the top of fundamentally in a society like America. And you can only fake it so long. If you take a government job, go the government route, maybe you can. But overall, you get exposed eventually. And it's not necessarily a great path for you to just get thrown into Harvard because you had the right skin tone or you wrote about being a four-spirit furry lesbian on your admissions application. That might not actually mean a better life for you because a lot of people will be wondering when they find out you're a four-spirit furry, did you actually get this job on merit? So that's why it'd be nice to treat people equally in the sense that you can be a cis hetero white male and be treated the same as a four-spirit BIPOC furry, which we all know that a lot of these institutions, a lot of these corporations, and a lot of these universities will always side with the four-spirit BIPOC furry over the cis hetero white Christian male because of the diversity characteristics. And that's not a good society. That's not an equitable society. That's not a fair society. So we don't like it. It's not good. And it just doesn't make sense there's all these stories now, like remedial math class that's being offered to people at Harvard because they can't keep up. And just how do you get into Harvard and need remedial math? It would be unthinkable even just 2 decades ago that would be the case. And now we're there and it's all because of the DEI. We need to get past it. But then you see Susan Rice, who's not a dumb person, just pushing it. She wants more DEI. All right. So Misty has done something which is really interesting. And I like to track when things are changing. So this is the big, because we got to see what's next on the show. Part of the thing that we do Breitbart very well. And one of the challenges that the Democrats have at the moment is they need to compete with the conservative dominance in podcasting. And podcasting is it's an intimate medium. People are really connecting with people through podcasts now. It is the medium of the present and likely the future. And it's a way where Republicans have really distinguished ourselves and conservatives because no matter what wing of the conservative movement you find yourself in, typically the people who've risen to the top of our movement can hang in these long form interviews and they don't get exposed for having thin ideas. And Democrats don't have those types of people. Kamala Harris is the top example of this. She just comes off as the more you hear her talk, the more of an idiot she sounds. And so one person who's trying to buck that is Pete Buttigieg. He's starting to do this. He's always wants to be president, so he'll be running for as long as he's alive. He's got a rebrand, so he's got a scruffy beard, he's got a better haircut, and he's got a better vibe going. And so he went on Andrew Schultz's podcast. Andrew Schultz, a comedian. I think he's sort of MAGA adjacent, but not exactly. He's very funny and edgy. and very tolerant, at least of the MAGA ideas. I think he says some stuff I don't like, but overall, he's trying to be funny first, which is always fine with me. But I think he does appeal to a lot of the MAGA younger men crowd. So Buttigieg is on there, and I want to give you some of this because it's important to see where they're at, because they're trying now. They're trying to get out there, see if they can do the stuff that the conservative politicians can do, which is do these long-form interviews. Let's play some of this.
Goes into or is supposed to go into here in the U.S. is what then turns around and makes it possible for businesses to thrive.
Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah, my favorite example is probably the smartphone. So have you ever noticed, like, in like talks, or like whenever somebody mentions a smartphone, they like start to pull it out of their pocket or like, touch it. But so the federal government could not have invented the iPhone, right? Like, I don't think any of us would want a phone that was like invented by the federal government.
That thing would suck.
That is like all of the design, the manufacturing, supply chains. That's the kind of thing that corporations can do very well. Yeah. And Apple did it very well, and their competitors. But what makes the iPhone work? Well, among other things, the internet. The internet was literally invented by a federal research project. And it would never have been possible to invent the internet with a private company, because you wouldn't have got the kind of capital return, even though it's $1 trillion idea or a multi-trillion-dollar idea. You know, companies can do multi-billion-dollar ideas.
So first of all, he's got this way of presenting things where he's just very condescending, and he says these very obvious ideas as if he just came up with them on his own. I mean, this is why these podcasts are great, because he thinks this is some sort of a brilliant idea, and is not. This is like something that a fifth grader could have explained to you, and he's explaining in this professorial way, like he's some sort of a genius. You remember that Wired piece about him? I think it was Wired, where he's got a vast cathedral mind. That's what I'm really getting from this. It's just they have this ability on the left. A lot of people have this. It's really good for communicating when you can make a real living doing this, where you explain obvious stuff as if it's a big revelation. Let's go on.
Ideas. But $1 trillion idea, like inventing the internet,
right,
that requires basic research. And that's the kind of thing the government's supposed to do, among many other things.
It requires basic research? What does that mean?
Yeah, by basic research, I mean things that are so fundamental that you actually don't know for 50 or 100 years if they're going to have a return. They might never work out.
Oh, right? Yeah, you can't look at it as...
Yeah, so this is sort of like a space program type deal. So, but the obvious retort is that really where we're spending most of our money in the government? Is it for this great research, or is it all just to create a government job programs, which is essentially welfare for Democrats? Is it in useless wars we don't need to do? Is it servicing the debt that never should have been as high as it is? I mean, is it for these entitlements for these bogus NGOs? So where is the money actually going? Is that really what Musk is doing? Is he's cutting off the research that's going to lead to the next internet? Is that what Musk, the guy with rocket ships in space who wants to go to Mars, is that what Doge is doing right now? Of course not. This is a comedian show, so I don't expect a great pushback here. But just know this is not a great persuasive idea from Buttigieg, from my opinion. Here we go.
You can't look at it as this thing is going to be profitable. It has to be
right. So it's different
benevolent
from
endeavor for society.
Yeah, it's different from research on like a pharmaceutical company researches a new medication, expecting
the thing is going to be profitable.
Okay, I'm putting this back a little bit, because where he goes next reveals exactly how vapid he is. So he's going to cite an example of research that he thinks has a guaranteed return. Listen to this.
I think it's going to be profitable. It has to be
so it's different
benevolent
from
endeavor for society.
Yeah, it's different from research on like a pharmaceutical company researches a new medication, expecting that they're going to
there's going to be a return in the next 10, 20 years.
Right, at least kind of within the kind of profit rate.
Yeah. But public parks is another version of this and stuff like that. Yeah, you can't privatize the public park.
Right, this is the whole idea of public goods. Right? This is why we have governments, why we collect taxes.
God, we're turning into such lids already, dude.
So pharmaceutical companies have no idea if their research is going to work. They know long term if they are researching enough drugs. But this is the big stress in if you follow the industry well, that a lot of CEOs, for example, they live and die based on the success of one drug. If they test something out and they spend years developing it and they build a plan for it and never gets that FDA approval, then you lose your job. Your stock price goes through the floor. So for him to suggest that pharmaceutical companies are doing research because they know it's going to yield a profit, yeah, well, if they do it enough times, they would assume so, but there's never a guarantee. It's a terrible example, and it just shows you that his arguments are so thin. For him to suggest that, well, if we're going to invent the internet, we don't know if it's going to succeed or when, so we need to have government funds for that. But pharmaceutical companies, they know their products are going to succeed. They have no idea if their products are going to succeed. That is the nature of the private sector, is that anyone who launches a new business, you have no idea if they're going to succeed. And most great entrepreneurs will tell you they had businesses that failed. So he just sounds like a guy who spent his whole life in the government. And that's who he is. And it just reminds you, people with private sector experience really should be prioritized. And I'm not saying you should just come in like Donald Trump and you have no government experience. That's tough too in its own ways. But a guy who just spent his whole life being a politician is just not going to be the type of guy to lead this country, because these are just idiotic ideas. And that's why it's good to see them in these longer formats, because he will be exposed. He's touted as a smart guy. These are not smart arguments. Let's skip ahead in the interview, and we got some more clips.
The other thing that nobody talks about in either party much is poverty. Like, you may notice in political rhetoric, like people, middle class, you're always supposed to say middle class. You always talk about the middle. Can't go wrong talking about the middle class. But not all folks are talking about like poor and low wealth people, which, depending how you count, is more than 100 million Americans.
Jeez.
And by the way, is an experience that binds together a lot of people who are divided in terms of first generation immigrants, white, black, and brown people, and so forth. And one of the things that should be
well, why don't we talk about poverty? Because we already are giving handouts to everyone in poverty. Like, we try our best to give them handouts. And no one wants to take away any entitlements from anyone who is getting the handouts, because that's political death. So we don't talk about taxing the poor more, because no one would ever do that politically. And we can't afford to give out much more aid than we give out, but we give out a lot. So this is another one of these ideas where this is not a great idea, and he's acting like he's a genius. Like, we should be talking about poverty more. We talk about poverty quite a bit, and there's not much to say beyond what's being said now, other than that it would be nice to do if we all had more of a charitable spirit. So then maybe some more charitable organizations were thriving instead of confiscating more of our wealth to get wasted by the government. That'd be a nice thing to talk about, but he's not going to suggest that. He thinks the government needs to do more poverty prevention or whatever that is, but he just means handouts. He just wants more government largesse.
The starkest wake-up call for my party is the idea of losing the vote of poor people.
Yep.
Because if we're not winning the vote of poor people, like, what are we even doing out here? Right?
Yep.
And we don't really talk about poverty.
Yep.
Or that kind of insecurity that people go through.
Yeah. Or like, what are you promoting or seemingly promoting, or what are the Republicans projecting to you that you're promoting that they are so against that they will reject whatever you endeavor to do to help them with their poverty?
Yeah.
Meaning there might be another thing out there that is equally or potentially more important.
Right. Which is why the way to not talk to low income people or union people, members, or anybody else, is to say like, oh, well, you're voting against your own self-interest.
It's like, how are you going to tell me what I'm interested in?
Yeah. But also, like, you can picture like well-paid professional from I don't know, somewhere near where we're sitting in New York City, like going up to a union member who is living near where I live in Michigan, and if that person from New York says like, you're voting against your self-interest, that guy can turn around and say, so are you.
Yeah.
So this is the pattern. He's got nothing to say. I got one more clip, but the guys, it's worth emphasizing that they pop up. And you see why they're not doing these shows, because they don't have much to say.
There has to be some like logic to it or order to it if you want to shape the behavior of other countries, right? And what we're seeing instead is this like really like chaotic, like grab ass policy where like he changes his mind every couple of days on things, right?
So he's talking about Trump, and he's doing this stuff where he keeps saying right for some reason, and he says grab ass because he wants to use a swear word because that's what Democrats do now. And he looks cool and he sounds declarative, but he's not saying anything again. And Trump's policies are not grab ass, or whatever that means. It's not even an expression that people use. Trump's policies are generally pretty coherent, but he doesn't bother to learn the policies because he doesn't care, because he doesn't saying that Trump actually has a coherent vision and we need to counter it in this way. That doesn't get you cultural currency on the left now. What does is to just announce that Trump is a bad rich man.
And that makes it that much harder, especially if you're a small business or if you're a giant corporation. You have all kinds of hedges and like ways you can maneuver through this.
Or they'll just remove the tariffs. That was another thing that really frustrated me. If you're going to put the tariffs on, put them on everything.
Seems to me like, hold it.
Yeah, right, now they're like picking and choosing what they're going to apply.
Yeah, so now Apple doesn't have the tariffs.
Right.
And
All right, I'm dragging this on too long. This is not. He's not going anywhere, and that's good. It's good to play. So, Missy, let's keep doing that. Whenever they do the long podcast, let's try to see if they got anything, and so we can be prepared. But this is where they need to play a lot of catch up here because they cannot hang for long interviews. Ton of other stuff going on. over at Breitbart.com. Judge barring Trump from denying federal funds to sanctuary cities that limit immigration cooperation. So another a judge out in California, Judge William Orrick, and he's famous. I got to look into him. But he's saying another preliminary injunction saying that Trump can't cut off sanctuary cities. So it's just all of these judges acting like presidents, and we do not have a solution to deal with it. We've got to figure it out. We got to figure it out fast. We got some great coverage over what's going on over at 60 Minutes. I mentioned this on yesterday's show briefly with Sherry Redstone, who's on the chair of the Paramount board, saying you've got to cut out the fake news about half the country, and CBS melting down over it. We love to see that blue on blue type violence. She's not blue. She's got to be one of us, I'm guessing. But, you know, the Paramount board, you would think overall is a left-wing entity. World Economic Forum investigating founder Klaus Schwab over corruption allegations. So they're investigating themselves. So maybe they'll determine he really did a great job. But we have more for that on you at Breitbart, for you at Breitbart News. But that's cool. Who knows? It'd be great if they if the World Economic Forum chewed up and spit out Klaus Schwab. It kind of would be a smart move, because if the WEF wants to be a valid entity and respected by the Trump movement, for example, which is very powerful in the world right now, then, you know, distancing themselves from Schwab would be smart. I don't think it'll happen, but we'll see. Maybe it's the first step. And last thing I'll mention for now, everyone is hip now to Abrego Garcia being in Tennessee and carrying 8 passengers with no luggage, all of whom listed his house as their residence. And that might suggest that he was involved in human smuggling and international crime. This is something that we had first at Breitbart. I've been hammering it all week. I spoke to Emma Jo before our interview yesterday, and yesterday's show was really good. So you guys should check out my Emma Jo interview if you're inclined. But she had said, no one's talking about this. You're the only one talking about it. And I said, I know. That's what we do here at Breitbart News and the Marlow Show. Now everyone's on it. So everyone gets the picture that this is the smoking gun for Abrego Garcia, that he was clearly involved in international human trafficking. There's no other scenario where you'd have 8 passengers with no luggage. They all listed your house as their address. And unless you were doing human smuggling, human trafficking, whatever it is. So that's it. That is very, very, very relevant here, and it should be case closed. Do not bring him back. And if you do, just deport him again. All right, that'll be it for now. We'll get into it with Carol Roth. Before we do, I will tell you it is the pre-ken, so I will be out there barbecuing on my Solaire infrared grill, besthotgrill.com, made in America, high-quality products, and I use it once or twice a week at least. I'm picturing the skirt steak tacos, get the marinade going, and then I'm going to get it as hot as possible. It's the perfect way to do the skirt steak is because of the thin cut. Fire it up, get that little crust on both sides that makes it taste extra, a little crispy, then juicy. Give it a nice long rest, at least 10 minutes, probably 20 minutes. And that is going to let the meat relax, tenderize. And I'm going to make some homemade tortillas, really easy to make some homemade salsa, and my family is going to go bananas for it. But the key ingredient is that Solaire infrared grill. It's it's barely even an ad, guys. It really is. Besthotgrill.com. You get the hottest, fastest grill on the market, and it lets you just cook your food as well as you can cook certain items, like that skirt steak I'm going to be doing. All right, let's get into it with Carol Roth. All right, my guest today is Carol Roth. She's the author of the book You Will Own Nothing and is the latest PragerU presenter. You know how much I love my PragerU videos. I always learn something from it. And this one is about how the government doesn't make money. You do. I want to get into that. But Carol, if anyone's not familiar with you in the audience, I think most people are, but could you give us a little bit of your background just so people know where you're coming from?
Yeah, so I consider myself a recovering investment banker. It's a 12-step program. I'm somewhere stuck on stage 11, always doing a little bit of deals still. I am a 2 times New York Times bestselling author, just like you, Alex. And,
yeah, it's exact same number. Exact
same number. So we're going to both have to get on that. And, an entrepreneur, small business advocate, have my hands in a lot of different things, but I think what most people know me for is my economic, business, and financial commentary, where I sort of connect the dots in a way that whether you're a novice or somebody who is, very advanced, either way you can kind of hopefully understand what's going on, which is one of the things that I love about PragerU, because it lets me take these big concepts and break them down in a way that even kids can understand.
Yeah, I do love that about them, because a lot of places, and I'm writing and reading constantly and listening to things constantly, there's still a lot of issues where I don't have the basic 101 framework that you need to be able to start. You can't form an opinion or a strategy sometimes when you don't know the fundamentals. And PragerU they're really the only entity that's trying to do that. Like, here's the basic stuff. And you do that with this video, which is basically about how taxation is just confiscating wealth from the people who are productive members of society and just gives it to the government. And just really just the way it's so simple, the way you describe it, but it makes taxation seem very offensive to me, which I like, because I find it to be very offensive. And you do my favorite thing, which is you note that it's at gunpoint, which means that you can't get out of this, or they will bring the heavy artillery to come get the money from you. And I feel like that it's so healthy to talk about it this way, and we never do for some reason.
Yeah, it's. I think there's just a fundamental misunderstanding, that the government doesn't make money; it takes it, as you said, from by gunpoint. And so many people in the discourse, when they talk about the government and the government spending, they make it seem like the government, has done something and they've made their own money and they're going to spend their money, when it's never their money; it's our money. And we don't get into this in the video because it's a little bit more of a advanced concept, but even when they quote unquote print money out of nowhere, it's still taking away your productivity. So starting and putting that baseline down of what it means, for the government to have funds, and the fact that no matter how much they spend, they're always coming hat in hand like that, crazy uncle that you give them money and, to go away because they need it, and then they blow it and come back to you. And I feel like that's a very good representation of the government today.
Yeah, and it feels like when you have such great stats in here, and this is why I feel like we just blow through some of the fundamentals. But one of the stats in the video is that we confiscate from our citizens every year more than the GDP of every country other than the U.S. and China. I couldn't believe this. Share this for me if I have it correct, or if I have it incorrect. Well, please correct me. But that's just a wild number, and the fact that we spend more than that, how is that acceptable?
It's completely unacceptable. And that's, it's when you start saying numbers like, the government took from us $5 trillion, almost $5 trillion in quote unquote revenue, that's our productive earnings, and spent it. It's hard to understand what that even means without context, because it is such a large number. But when you start saying, okay, other than the US and China, it's more than the entire output of every other country in the world, and we still cannot keep to a budget. We, in fact, spend $2 trillion more than that, which as a percentage of our GDP is equivalent to a wartime deficit to GDP. So to put things in a context where these really big numbers that start to just, make people's brains melt can actually be compared to something that they can understand, I think gives that context around the issue. And then understanding that then gives you the foundation to be able to say, okay, what is it that we need to be doing here?
So give me your take on Doge. Do you think Doge is identifying the right stuff? Because I have a very interesting, I think maybe even unique position in conservative media, is that I've been a long-time Musk skeptic, and I've been trying to warn people that his ties to China are too deep, and a lot of what he does is hype, and it's not necessarily meets what he is able to. He's a terrific promoter, but I'm also world's biggest Doge fan, and I love the concept of it. I feel like it could be totally historical in its significance, but I hear from a lot of people I trust that maybe they're not cutting fast enough, and maybe the cuts that are happening are just stuff that the Senate just identified, and that's just where they're going for, and they're not really finding anything new. And it's hard to know, and I don't know if they're messaging great on this, but what is your take?
Well, first of all, I'm going to tell you that you must be a happy person in life because you can separate art from artist. And I always say that's the key to happiness, is that you may or may not like a person or be skeptical, but you can still look at work and judge that independently. So good for you, Alex, on that. I'm in the same.
But by the way, Carol, that was so well put, because I find myself thinking about this concept a lot, how you can judge the product and you can judge the individual differently, and it can change, and that makes life much more interesting when you have that. But maybe it does even make me happy. But that's so great, because this came up earlier in the week where I was trying to differentiate. I was trying to evaluate some woke piece of television, and I was trying to also explain its merits to the audience. And it would have been nice if I had that vocabulary at my fingertips. But
well, I'm glad that I can help you out. Feel free to use that without attribution in the future.
I will.
So with Doge, I think the idea of it is great. It does seem like they're getting into pockets and identifying waste and fraud. Yeah. The piece that is sort of a black box to me is now what? So now that we've identified it, is that just money that's already been appropriated somewhere, so then it moves over to somewhere else to be spent? Yeah. Is that actually coming out of spending on a recurring basis? And I think that's the area where the messaging has broken down, maybe intentionally, because the entire structure of the system is so opaque, and it's hard to know what is going to be the next step. But that's a big question for me. There's also, me being sort of the economic wonk here, another issue that is afoot, which is the fact that we are in this hair on fire debt situation. Our debt to GDP is that of an emerging market in crisis. We're only not in crisis yet because we have the world's reserve currency. As I mentioned before, we have these deficits to GDP that are wartime deficits to GDP, and we're not technically in a war right now. And then we have interest on our debt that actually exceeds the spending on our defense. So this is a massive issue. We are really on the precipice of a major sovereign debt crisis. And what happens is if Doge identifies this and it is cut too fast, cut too quickly before we amp up the GDP and we explode deficits to GDP because we end up taking in less from revenue, because as we know, government spending goes into the GDP calculation, we could actually put ourselves into that crisis, into a debt spiral. So there is a certain choreography or order of operations that we really need to be aware of. And perhaps that's one of the reasons they're slow playing it, is they need to amp up GDP. They need to amp up growth at the same time they're doing the cutting. Otherwise, when you add up all the different components, you're going to end up in a worse deficit position. And I think that's hard for people sometimes to get their heads wrapped around. And certainly right now, given the trade war and tariff challenges that we have, that also could be putting a drag onto GDP. That creates another issue for this Doge spending and kind of this math equation that we're facing.
Right. Okay. So I want to get to the tariffs, but let's talk about what are the growthiest policies Trump could pursue. He wants a big tax cut. I think deregulating, getting the energy sector going, those seem like pretty easy steps to take. But what from your vantage point, would you be recommending if you were leading the Economic Council?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely it. I mean, deregulation is the way. I mean, one of the easiest things they could do is they could make it easier for businesses to hire. You have 35 million small businesses in this country, and only 6 million of them have employees because it's so expensive, difficult, and full of bureaucracy to hire that first employee, to go from 0 to 1. So there are a whole slew of, deregulation efforts that they could make in all different kinds of industries that I think would help. Certainty on tax policy and having permanent tax cuts would be alongside of that. I know there's some discussion of them taxing the quote unquote, super wealthy or wealthy. And again, they have to be careful of that back to small business, because a lot of those businesses are pass-through entities, and you may end up doing this and hurting small businesses again. So I think that's, those are clearly the things that lead the way. We could have some sort of an energy or other productivity miracle that happens that would unleash, our prosperity and growth. I don't think that happens overnight. So anything they can do to cut down the barriers, I think would be very helpful in terms of juicing the economy, and certainly not erecting new barriers, which, may be a lead into another conversation, and creating uncertainty, because it's impossible for businesses to make investments, to hire, to plan, to do all of those kinds of things, to grow, if they're not sure what policies are going to all of a sudden change the game for them, in the days and weeks and months ahead.
So I know you're skeptical of the tariff policy. Just here, I want to get your vantage point, just big picture on the concept of tariffs, just sort of where you stand in that in general. And then I want to talk about some of the specifics of what we know about what Trump is attempting. But just give me your overall take on it, because I know you're not a pro-tariff gal.
So I'm generally not pro-tariffs, although I kind of always consider myself a little bit more tariff neutral, because I do think there are places where it can make sense if it's used very surgically. And I think that everybody, even the people who are generally against tariffs, would agree there are certain areas that pertain to national security, whether it be shipbuilding, whether it be defense, manufacturing and ammunition and things like that, even things in the pharmaceutical supply chain that it may make sense to have tactics that don't align with, all the other tactics.
Sure.
But to have a wholesale overnight shift that is really a barrier for businesses and then ultimately the consumers, when we have a 70% consumer driven economy, when there is no place to sort of switch to, is not my favorite way to go about this. I think that a lot of the objectives, and by the way, this is one of my big issues, is I don't think anybody can actually explain the objective. If you talk to 10 different people, you will hear 10 different reasons why we're doing the tariff policy. And so it's very hard to have a strategy when you don't know what that is. But let's say it's something like reshoring. Well, you reshore, in my opinion, by creating the incentives to reshore, making it easier to do that. It's our regulation, it's our labor and our energy that is making it more expensive and more difficult to have that manufacturing here in the United States, as well as the fact that, by the way, we have all of these people that are not filling jobs in skilled trades, including manufacturing today, which is another myth that's out there. But there are clearly issues. I mean, there are many issues. I just think the punishing American businesses and consumers while addressing those, overnight is not the way to go about that.
Yeah, I think that one thing that the administration has not done a good job of is articulating the non-economic intangibles that are going into the tariffs. Is that, from my vantage point, China never being held accountable for the coronavirus, China not being held accountable for the fentanyl trade, the national security implications of being dependent on foreign countries for the things we need for our national security, the chips, the pharmaceuticals, as you mentioned, that we cannot be dependent on foreign countries to have that stuff. And it just does, it feels like very secondary part of the messaging. The messaging is threading the economic needle, that's the hardest one, actually. It's to justify it on a pure economic level, because I ideologically like the idea of the America First economic policy and eventually reestablishing that manufacturing base and the reshoring, which I think is going pretty well. I want your take on that in a second. But overall, give me your assessment of the messaging, because I feel like it could be a lot better. And I feel like if Scott Bessent isn't talking, then I'm definitely getting lost. Like, I'm going backwards on a personal level.
Scott Bessent is the all-star from the administration, and unfortunately, I don't think that he has, enough of the internal clout yet to maybe be setting the policy, but certainly is helping to calm the markets. Everybody knows his background and trusts him. I think that some of the things, the messaging has been abysmal because, as I said, there's 10 different messages. Things that come out are then walked back on a daily basis. It's not cohesive, and everybody has sort of a different reason. If we wanted to punish China for the things that they absolutely do, I think it would make more sense to split it up and say, okay, if you are a Chinese business that is selling direct to our consumer, like the Temus and Sheins of the world, maybe we slap a tariff on you. But if you're a U.S. business that has a China supply chain that, you're going to lose out on jobs, revenue, profits, and probably give that business over to a foreign competitor or even a big business, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, especially when we don't have the options to switch. So it's not like we have a 36-month program where they're investing and making all of these alternative options to switch to. So I just think that the way that this has gone about, the tactics and even some of the overarching strategy really aren't the best way to go about this, because it could end up, we have a lot more at stake stake right now than China does. You have to remember, China is a country that just locked everybody, down for multiple years in their apartments, like completely, and came out the other end. They don't care. They're a communist country.
But this is another thing that the administration is clearly conscientiously made a decision to not talk about this stuff because China is much weaker than the American media would present. And that's one of these things where they're vulnerable. The administration clearly sees China as vulnerable. I'm sure that's part of why the timing of these moves is happening. And yet none of them will say this. None of them will say, well, an added component is we feel like this is the time to move on China because they're weak, because their economy is not doing very well. The virus crushed them at a level that no one really fully understands. But it'd be nice to kind of hear someone who's in charge of doing this every day walk us through some of that, but we're not getting any of it. I gotta connect the dots and talk to a couple of people who might know something, and then we start formulating it. But that's not.
I think there's a reason, though. There's actually two reasons. One is that there are certain areas where we are completely dependent upon them, and we've seen that with the rare earth minerals.
Sure.
And so there are cards that they're holding where we're just as much of an issue than they are in. So that's the thing. The second thing is, in dealing with China, there is a cultural sort of phenomenon about saving face and respect. And to the extent that we are ever going to get a deal with China, we cannot come out and publicly embarrass them in that way, or else we will never get to a deal. And, Americans must say, well, too bad, we're America, whatever. Well, if we want to, all get along and play nice and make sure that we, don't have major supply chain, pharmaceutical components and defense components and whatnot withheld from us, that is not a good strategy. So I think the fact that they have slow played that at least gives me comfort that they understand that the respect is really important. And frankly, I think that's how they're going to get to whatever deal they get to. My very cynical but realistic view is that they're going to, come up with a couple of very flimsy wins, say, oh, we negotiated the best deal of all time and we're all going to move on, and none of this is going to have been worth it. So that's just my perspective.
Okay, so one other element, the whole China of it all is that they still have slave labor, basically, sweatshops. And we have chosen not to message to the people who want the status quo that it's essentially an endorsement of slave labor. And I've talked to very smart people who are completely comfortable with it because it's better for Americans that we get the benefit, that we benefit from the sweatshop labor. And it's one of these things where it's not part of the discussion at all, as it'd be nice if the world moved on from being dependent on Chinese sweatshops. Yeah.
Well, so I would say there are a couple things, and this is a very complicated concept, but there's definitely an area of China where they use the Uyghurs to do manufacturing, and there has been, and that's mostly in the apparel, and it's an absolute horrible human rights violation, and there has been a movement within the apparel industry to suss that out and basically make people go through their supply chains to try to verify that. Now, I'm not saying that it actually works or not. There's a reason why they're still there, and that should be addressed. But again, China's a huge country and has a lot of manufacturing. There are many manufacturing partners who are not slave labor, who have been, working in industries. I do a lot of work in the toy and collectible industries. Frankly, they have been doing that since the 1970s. If you have a late 70s Star Wars action figure by Kenner, that was made from a Chinese factory, that is not slave labor, that, puts forth wages that helps create their middle class. So I think when we have these discussions, there's such a rush to say, oh, well, you're dependent on slave labor. Well, there are a lot of people who aren't. And so I think it's important for us to be nuanced in the discussion and say, there are really great, legitimate manufacturing partners there. However, there is this component that we should stand up and stand against. And nuance is not great for social media. It's not great for regular media. And it does not excuse China. I mean, China, again, is a communist country. And frankly, a lot of companies have started to decouple, right? Have done the right thing, have moved away to Vietnam, to India, to other areas. But again, that was one of the things that sort of blew everybody's mind is like, okay, I made the right decision. I decoupled from China. And now you're still slapping a tariff on me as my reward for, going through and making all of this an investment. So it is a very complicated issue. And I do think it would be great to have more manufacturing options outside of China, to have more in the US. But this is a complex thing that's not going to be done with a hammer overnight. And we cannot completely create mass chaos and disruption, especially given our financial position. If it was 10 or 15 years ago, there may have been a lot more runway, but given where we are financially and also, on the small business end of it, 5 years of being beaten up by COVID policy, supply chain disruptions, Biden inflation, labor issues, like everybody's sort of hanging on by a thread here. And there needs to be an awareness of the context of where we are and make the strategies and tactics match with the reality of that backdrop.
The media is broken. For decades, big cable and legacy media have filtered information to hide the truth. But thanks to podcasts and new media like this show, the truth can break through, providing voices and views the legacy outlets block from the air. But big cable still has one major way to control information, and that's access. They do this by limiting access to something called spectrum, the invisible airwaves that power affordable wireless internet, and by forcing you into their bundles, keeping independent media out of reach. Trump and Republicans in Congress have a chance to do something big here by making more spectrum available and breaking big cable's stranglehold on information. So there's a couple things you could do to find out more. You can go to endthecableopoly.org. That's endthecableopoly.org for more information about how to make more spectrum available. And if you're convinced, you should call your senators and your members of Congress and say, hey, why don't you work with President Trump and try to make more spectrum available? So endthecableopoly.org to find more. Okay, so I want to get into what we can do to message better and even set better policy on the tariffs. But there's a couple of things that appear positive to me that I want your take on. It does feel like we are getting some real reshoring, some real manufacturing announcements from pharmaceutical companies, from tech companies that are making big investments in the United States. And I think a lot of it is because people feel like Trump is serious about keeping tariffs on, and they see a bunch of America First guys warming up in the bullpen to perhaps be the president in 4 years or 8 years. And a lot of these companies, they're not going to build plants overseas at the same rate as they were. And do you view that as much of a positive as I do? I mean, it's hard to argue against that stuff.
No, of course we don't argue against that stuff. I mean, I think there are a lot of companies, whether it was during the first Trump administration, in the interim, before that, after that, that understand the issues with having foreign supply chain exposure. And certainly COVID cast a light on that. And for those critical industries where it is cost effective for us to manufacture, they absolutely should be manufacturing here. And so I think whether we have the tariffs or not, some of these announcements that get tied to the tariffs, people and companies don't make these massive investments overnight. So it's a nice PR thing to say, oh, it's because of this. But these are decisions that are going on over long periods of time. And it absolutely makes sense. There are things we should be manufacturing here, and we should have more manufacturing here. There are things that it is never going to make sense, or at least, until the robots figure out how to do small batches and things with, little finger movements and the like, so they're going to be somewhere else. And, it may be Mexico, it may be Vietnam, it may be Indonesia, it may be somewhere else. It doesn't have to be China. Sure. And I think that's okay too. And that's also lost in the messaging, is that there are a lot of companies that have other aspects of their business, pretty much their whole business, the design, the development, the marketing, the sales, the administration, the distribution, and bring the profits and the capital into the U.S. And they do have part of their supply chain overseas, and that is okay too. So I think that we, again, just need to have a nuanced conversation and a more surgical conversation. I think, Alex, if they had come out and said, we are going to focus on mission critical industries, we're focusing on defense, we're focusing on pharmaceuticals, we're focusing on technology, because this is the areas where we are at risk, I don't think anybody has an issue with that. And that makes it more palatable palatable than to say like, hey, small business who's, importing this gadget or making a fashion doll or, making an oven mitt that like all of a sudden you're now going to be completely crushed in the process here.
Leftwing coming out and saying we're going to be screwing small screws in and then maybe we'll have a robot do it is like, oh my God, that's like who let him out there at that talking point? It's unbelievable. As a pro-tariff guy, I'm going, please stop. No, that's not.
But there's a dual reality to it, and the reality is we do know the robots are coming for our jobs, but we also know that there are hundreds of thousands of jobs across all kinds of skilled industries that are going to get worse as the older boomers and whatnot retire, where we need, including in manufacturing, machinists and other skilled manufacturing labor. We need plumbers. We need technicians. We need, all the, electricians, all of those trades. So what also would be great to bring back, more jobs to America. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to invest and incentivize training and retraining the workforce, because that's really the biggest issue here is we can't even fill, I keep hearing like, we need to create all of these middle-class jobs. Like we can't even fill the ones that are available. So I would like to see some more realistic discussion on let's retrain the workforce and get them into these really important, high-value, high-skilled jobs alongside of a more surgical approach. I think everyone, the markets would be on fire, the economy, small business, everyone would just think that's great.
I want to talk to you about what to do about small businesses because this is your area of expertise. But I got one or two more tariff ideas that I wanted to bounce off you. It was really interesting to see that there was not a lot of retaliation from other countries. It was lightly Canada and China, and that's it. And everyone else, including these European superstates, were pretty much neutral to positive about working with Trump. Did that surprise you? Because I thought there would actually be more countries that would take a stronger line against him. But it seems like everyone at least wants to get in the phone and talk it through and not react negative. But maybe just America's so powerful that maybe that was always going to be the case.
Yeah, I think that's one of the good things about Trump is that he is a wild card and that he doesn't do the normal things. And so whatever playbook they might have had for, the Biden administration or the Obama administration or some other administration goes out the window. And so I think the realization is, okay, let's just try to talk it out. But I also feel like he could have done that first. If it were me, he's got Mar-a-Lago. Come invite everyone for a cocktail party. Have some, have some great music and shake some hands and kiss some babies. I feel like he's so charming. Like, why not use the charm approach first and then say, okay, listen, we tried to have this discussion and it didn't work. So it's nice that at least the Europeans are extending him that courtesy, and maybe they'll all sit down and they'll have some California wine and some French wine and it'll all be at the table and they can come to some kind of an agreement. Although we know President Trump, like me, doesn't drink alcohol. So maybe they'll just have the cheese, I guess.
But he still has the Trump vodka and the Trump champagne. I got to tell you, as a Californian, I'm trying to avoid the California wine because also overpriced. It's so wild. It's one of these funny things in the economy out here. So here's the big question. As someone who is generally supportive of President Trump, but generally negative on tariffs, if we could do it again, we could start fresh today. How are we messaging this? And what policy are we setting and how are we messaging it? Carol, you're in charge here. What do we do?
So when President Trump was elected with a resounding mandate, it was really about, we had this chaos in pricing. They wanted certainty. They wanted optimism. And that is what they got. And so if I were rolling this out, the very first thing I would have done is, really leaned into that optimism, done some things that around deregulation, tried to get the tax cuts in place and really focused on unleashing the growth first so that you have people off to the races, optimistic, feeling good. Then, as that's going on, again, I'm throwing my party at Mar-a-Lago and trying to come up with a very charming president to charm them all into creating some sort of trade deals that I can announce without anybody getting hurt. first, and then saying, okay, these are the holdouts. And so we're going to have to do something. And where we're going to start with this is we're going to be very surgical and we're going to focus in these areas. And I think that had that happened with very clear messaging on why, that everybody would be happy, things would be shooting to the moon, we would be off to the races instead of having the uncertainty that could create legacy issues later in the year. So that's the way that I would have played it. And by the way, I don't think it's too late. One of the great things that we've seen from the president over the last few weeks is the willingness to pivot, that he throws things out there and maybe it doesn't make sense and he pivots. And I think there's still a narrow window to start making some pivots so that we can kind of reclaim that and maybe get back on track with that optimism and growth. But it's going to take that very clear messaging as, hey, I heard you, you didn't like the shock and awe, let us lay this out in how it's going to happen so that the businesses who are making investments can plan, the consumers who are, by the way, right now panic buying, don't feel like that they need to do that and then have used up all of their capital for later in the year and so on.
But do you find that a lot of those people are Democrats? Because anyone who's consuming our coverage at Breitbart is hearing that things are going to be fine. We could be wrong, but I feel like they are, and I feel like that's been the texture of the coverage. Is really what you got to go to the people who are looking to be alarmed by watching MSNBC and CNN seem to be the most inclined to freak out.
Well, I think that anybody who is thinking about making a large-scale purchase, regardless of what they're hearing, can just do the math in their head. We've lived through COVID. We know what supply chains are. I think there's also people who listen to financial news and understand the financial underpinnings. Because, again, this isn't just happening in a vacuum. This is happening with the Biden administration handing us a fiscal foundation that has tripwires all over the place. So I do think that across the board, and maybe it's from a different point of view, the Democrats are doing it on an emotional basis and people on the right are doing it from more of a financially informed basis, that there are people who are making these decisions in a certain way. But I don't think if this goes on for more than a couple of weeks without a massive shift that we are going to be fine because of that fiscal foundation. And the fact is, as I've said many times before, that we have holiday in Q4, which is the biggest quarter of the year, basically makes or breaks lots of retailers and consumer products companies. And a lot of that is being put in place right now. And so if they're not able to do that, that's going to have a massive impact on the fourth quarter. And that's going to be very ugly given where our deficits to GDP are. Okay, so a lot of words of caution in there. I want to shift focus a little bit to small businesses, which is you've been a big advocate for small businesses. And so first question is two-part question. What is the Trump policy on small business right now, and what do you recommend any short-term changes we should be making? So one of the things that has been great out of the administration, and we've heard Besant sort of repeat this in various forms, as they said that Wall Street had their turn and now it's Main Street's turn. And Main Street should be first and leading the way for our growth and prosperity, which small business, the backbone of the economy, as I mentioned, 35 million entities, and they've really been beaten up and do need their chance to shine. So the fact that there's an awareness of that, I think, again, created a lot of optimism. So far, we've had one really big win out of the Trump administration. And frankly, again, from Treasury, there was this Corporate Transparency Act beneficial ownership information reporting rule that was basically treating small businesses like financial criminals. And it's crazy.
Unbelievable. I've got 1 million small businesses for different reasons. And I've been, Antifa put my address out online. It's like I don't want to disclose stuff I don't have to. It's just, and then all of a sudden the government's like, oh, you got to disclose everything. Like, what did I ever do? Like, just get targeted? So now I got to disclose everything? It's just ridiculous. And I'm glad they tried to do away with that. So
basically they said that they would not enforce that against U.S. entities and U.S. citizens, which is a huge one because it primarily impacted small businesses because all the big businesses were exempt. Go figure. We still, by the way, still need Congress to codify it, but at least for this administration, they came out of the gate day one and really helped out small business. So that's great. After that, again, if you're a small business, and you have to remember, small businesses with so many different industries are going to have different perspectives, but there are millions of small businesses that have part of their supply chain abroad, and they are freaking out because they are not Apple. They don't have tens of billions of dollars in their balance sheets. They cannot absorb, these massive increases in the cost of goods. So I know with my clients, what a lot of them are doing is they're just pushing everything out as far as possible and in a wait and see mode, but that impacts their cash flow for the year. Sure. And then obviously impacts, hiring and in some cases, debt payments and all different kinds of things. So which is why I go back to the narrow window. So I think that's something that they could turn. Tax policy would be there are a couple of different things in terms of small business deductions and not making that, that higher, pushing up that higher rate that will definitely help small business. And I think the jury's sort of out on, where that is going to fall. But I think the Trump administration understands that. I would like to see more Main Street advocates at the table. They had a great meeting with the retailers, with Walmart and Lowe's and Home Depot. Mm-hmm. I'd like to see the same meeting happen with some small business advocates, some organizations and small business owners, and really show, that as they're thinking about policy, that they're thinking about the small business implications. And I think if there's any guy who's going to, be open to doing that, that would be President Trump.
So I got to get your take on the floated idea of $5,000 to have a child. I'm all for encouraging family creation. It seems economically not. I don't think it makes a lot of sense, but the audience heard me go through this on yesterday's show, so give me your take.
Have you heard of this story or the philosophy of the Cobra effect?
Perhaps, but it's not ringing a bell right now.
Yeah, so there was a cobra problem in a city in India many years ago, and they basically put a bounty and they said, kill the cobras and bring it in and we'll pay you for it. And so what ended up happening is everybody started breeding cobras right. And there was more cobras so that they could get the bounty, and then they had to remove the bounty, and then they let go all the cobras and there were more cobras. So people should have kids because they're incentivized, because they love kids and they want to be really good parents. And if you don't want to be a really good parent and love your kid, you should not have a bounty. It's going to incentivize all of the wrong people to have kids for the wrong reasons. And I think that is a absolutely terrible idea. That's something that, again, government should stay out of. They should make it, as easy as possible to not have regulations that, impact families. But that's something that from a community and a culture standpoint, we should be encouraging people who are in loving relationships and, who have parents involved who love kids, saying, hey, it's, this, let's find a way to make it easier for you. But I don't think, cash for babies, like cash for gold, seems like a great idea.
Yeah, this is another thing. So for me, I cite myself because I feel like I'm sort of a paradigmatic example of a dual income household where both parents have to work because we didn't inherit wealth. I didn't make a great crypto play where I've got $100 billion. So I got to work all day. And so is my wife, and my wife's a doctor. So she's in a nurturing feminine profession where she goes and takes care of the sick people in the community, and she has to leave the house. And so we have full-time help. I only get to write off the tax. So it's costing me. So why can't I write off that job? Because if I just lied and said that my nanny is a researcher for one of my books, then it's a full write-off. But the fact that she comes into my house and she makes a lot of money from me, then I can only write off the tax portion of it. And it's just one of the things where, how about that? That actually would make a difference. The $5,000 I was saying to the audience, that 1 month of student loans for my wife. It's like, I'm not gonna have a kid for that. So what are we getting at here? It just seems really not well thought through, is my point.
Yeah, well, and again, if it was, if there were other areas where they made the cost of living more effective, if they got some of the red tape and the cost out of the housing industry and things like that, then we wouldn't be in a position where both, parents felt the need that they had to work and have to go through the healthcare. So it kind of goes all the way down the line. I think doing it in a way, like you said, that with the incentives are aligned and make sense and don't have, associated disincentives with them, and also in ways that kind kind of cuts red tape and gets the government out of our lives is always preferable, because as soon as you put them in there and have them start making bribes for one thing, they're going to start making bribes for something else. And again, as we started this discussion, it's not their money, it's ours.
Sure, yeah, that's a perfect way to kind of round things out, I guess, for now, though I definitely want to do this again, hopefully soon. But let's give me your sense of, with the tax code being what it is, Trump has, he wants tax cuts badly. Connecting back to your PragerU video, you've always got Main Street in mind as opposed to Wall Street. What are the moves that you think are the no-brainers? He must do this while he's got the chance right now to get this economy roaring.
I mean, one great thing would be is if you took small businesses and instead of tax them at the individual rate, if you tax them at a corporate rate and even the playing field on that, I mean, that would absolutely unleash a lot of prosperity outside of the tax code. As I mentioned, if there was a way to be more pro independent contractor and flexible work, I know the administration was in their first term, but in a way that really gets out, some of these ridiculous IRS, regulations about what it means to be an employee. I think that also could open up, more use of independent contractors and businesses for small businesses and help them with their growth. Those are some of sort of the easy things off the top of my head, but certainly nothing that undoes all of the work that he's put in so far, which, in some cases seems like where we're trending.
Carol Roth, the PragerU video up at PragerU. Now you go to PragerU.com or their YouTube page for that. We will link that also in the show notes here. And you should read her book, You Will Own Nothing. You have another book, too. Is there another book that you want to point out to people?
So I will say, first thing, I have a free economic newsletter at carolroth.com/news. So that helps break down some of these things. And funny enough, my book before, I've written 3 books, but the one before You Will Own Nothing is called The War on Small Business. So kind of going through the COVID policies and what that did to small business. Wow. And I've been calling a lot of what's happening COVID 2.0, and you can see some of the parallels there that we want to make sure to avoid.
Amazing stuff. Well, let's do this again. carolroth.com/news for more from Carol. This has been great. Thank you so much. Thanks to producer Misty and all of you in the audience for telling 10,000 friends and family members about the show. Talk to you tomorrow.